When a quantum system is not observed, it evolves according to the Schrödinger equation, deterministic, continuous, reversible. But when a measurement occurs, the system appears to collapse into a single, definite state. This collapse is not described by the Schrödinger equation. It is an additional postulate inserted to match experimental outcomes. The theory tells us what probabilities to expect, but it does not explain the transition from potentiality to actuality. Some interpretations attempt to remove the collapse by other means. The many worlds interpretation eliminates it by asserting that all possible outcomes occur, each in a separate branch of reality. Bohmian mechanics replaces it with hidden variables and non-local guidance fields. Objective collapse theories propose that the wave function spontaneously localizes under certain conditions, independent of observation. Each interpretation avoids the collapse in its own way, but none of them address the original puzzle. Why is there something it is like to observe an outcome? Eugene Wigner, in the mid-20th century, suggested that consciousness itself might play a role in wave function collapse. He argued that the chain of measurement, detector interacts with particle, detector interacts with laboratory equipment, equipment interacts with experimenter, must terminate somewhere. If every physical system obeys quantum mechanics, then the entire chain remains in superposition until something non-physical intervenes. Wigner proposed that conscious awareness was that non-physical element. When a conscious observer becomes aware of a measurement result, the wave function collapses. This proposal was never widely accepted. It introduces consciousness as a fundamental physical agent without explaining how consciousness achieves this effect or what properties it must possess to do so. It also raises immediate difficulties. At what level of complexity does a system become conscious enough to collapse wave functions? Does a bacterium count? A thermostat? The proposal solves one mystery by invoking another, larger one. Most physicists today regard the measurement problem as a technical issue about decoherence and the emergence of classical behavior from quantum substrates. Decoherence explains how quantum superpositions become effectively classical through interaction with the environment. A quantum system entangled with many environmental degrees of freedom behaves, for all practical purposes, as if it has collapsed into a definite state. The superposition is still there mathematically, but it is no longer observable. This explains why we do not see macroscopic superpositions in everyday life. It does not explain why we experience anything at all. The distinction is crucial. Decoherence explains the transition from quantum to classical behavior in the mathematical formalism. It does not explain the transition from physical process to subjective experience. You can have a brain that functions perfectly, processes information, responds to stimuli, makes decisions, all describable by quantum mechanics and classical neuroscience, without invoking consciousness. The fact that there is something it is like to be that brain is an additional fact not predicted by the physics. This is what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, though they are not actually easy, involve explaining cognitive functions, how the brain processes sensory information, integrates it, stores memories, controls behavior. These are difficult scientific questions, but they are in principle answerable through neuroscience and computational modelling. The hard problem is different. It asks why any physical process, no matter how complex or sophisticated, should give rise to subjective experience. Why is there an inner life at all? Quantum mechanics does not address this question. Neither does classical physics. The equations describe structure, dynamics, correlation. They do not describe qualia, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the unified field of awareness in which these sensations appear. Some philosophers argue that qualia are not real, that they are illusions generated by cognitive processes. But this position is difficult to maintain. The one thing we know with absolute certainty is that we are conscious. Descartes' cogito remains unassailable. I think, therefore I am. The existence of thought, of awareness, is the most immediate datum of experience. So we have a mismatch. Quantum mechanics explains matter, energy, fields, particles, forces. It explains chemistry, solid-state physics, nuclear reactions, electromagnetic radiation. It does not explain awareness. This is not a failure of quantum mechanics within its domain. It is a boundary condition, a place where the theory stops and something else begins. But what is that something else? One possibility is that consciousness is an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing. Just as wetness emerges from the interactions of water molecules, even though no individual molecule is wet, perhaps consciousness emerges from the interactions of neurons, even though no individual neuron is conscious. This is the functionalist view. Consciousness is what certain types of computation feel like from the inside. If you replicate the functional organization of a brain in silicon, you replicate consciousness. This view has intuitive appeal, but it does not solve the hard problem. It shifts the question. Why should any computation, no matter how complex, have an inner, experiential dimension? A computer running a weather simulation processes vast amounts of information, but we do not believe it experiences anything. What is the difference? What is functionalism gives us criteria for when consciousness is present, but it does not explain why consciousness exists at all. Another possibility is panpsychism, the view that consciousness, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of reality, present to some degree in all physical systems. This is an old idea dating back to ancient philosophy, but it has gained renewed attention recently. If consciousness is fundamental, then quantum mechanics describes one aspect of reality, the structural, measurable aspect, and consciousness is another aspect, equally fundamental but not reducible to quantum states. The two aspects are correlated but not identical. Panpsychism avoids the problem of how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, because it denies that matter is fundamentally non-conscious. But it introduces new problems. How do micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences? How does the consciousness of an electron, if it has any, relate to the consciousness of a brain made of electrons? This is the combination problem, and it is as difficult as the emergence problem it replaces. A third possibility is that quantum mechanics itself needs modification. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposed a theory called orchestrated objective reduction, which posits that consciousness arises from quantum processes in microtubules inside neurons. Penrose argued, based on Gödel's incompleteness theorems, that human mathematical understanding is non-computable, that there are aspects of conscious thought that cannot be replicated by any algorithm. He suggested that this requires new physics, specifically a quantum gravitational mechanism that causes wave functions to collapse objectively, not merely through environmental decoherence. Hameroff identified microtubules as candidate structures that might support quantum coherence long enough for this process to occur. This theory is controversial. Most physicists and neuroscientists regard it as implausible. The brain is warm, wet and noisy. conditions that typically destroy quantum coherence in nanoseconds or less. Microtubules are indeed involved in cellular structure and transport, but there is no direct evidence that they support large-scale quantum effects relevant to consciousness. The theory also inherits the same explanatory gap. Even if quantum processes occur in microtubules, why should they generate subjective experience? Yet the theory has not been definitively refuted. Recent experiments have shown that quantum effects can persist in biological systems longer than previously expected. Photosynthesis uses quantum coherence to transfer energy efficiently. Birds may use quantum entanglement for navigation. These findings do not prove that consciousness is quantum, but they weaken the objection that quantum effects cannot survive in biological environments. More importantly, the theory takes seriously the idea that consciousness might require new physics. If classical and quantum mechanics together cannot explain awareness, perhaps we need a deeper theory, one that unifies quantum mechanics, general relativity, and consciousness in a single framework. This is speculative, but it is not absurd. The history of physics is a history of discovering deeper levels of explanation. Electromagnetism unified electricity and magnetism. Quantum field theory unified particles and forces. Perhaps a future theory will unify matter and mind. But we are not there yet. We have quantum mechanics, which explains nature with extraordinary precision. We have neuroscience, which maps the physical correlates of consciousness. We have philosophy, which clarifies the conceptual structure of the problem. We do not have a theory that bridges the gap between physical process and subjective experience. We do not know why there is something it is like to be a conscious system. We do not know if quantum mechanics will ever explain awareness, or if awareness lies forever outside its scope. The question is not whether quantum mechanics works. It does, with extraordinary precision. The mathematics predicts atomic spectra, chemical bonds, the behavior of semiconductors, the decay rates of unstable nuclei. It accounts for the stability of matter, the periodic table, the interaction of light with electrons. Every technology built on solid-state physics, transistors, lasers, magnetic resonance imaging, depends on quantum theory being correct to astonishing decimal places. This predictive success is not disputed. What remains unresolved is whether this theory, so powerful in describing the structure of nature, has anything to say about the existence of subjective experience. Not the neural correlates of awareness, not the computational properties of brains, not the information process that accompanies consciousness, but the fact that there is something it is like to be conscious at all. The question examined here is specific. If quantum mechanics describes physical systems so completely, why does it offer no account of awareness as such? The aim is not to solve this problem, but to clarify where the boundary lies between what quantum mechanics explains and what it does not. Quantum mechanics describes the behavior of systems in terms of wave functions, which evolve according to the Schrödinger equation. The wave function contains all the information about a system's possible states. When no measurement occurs, the system exists in a superposition, a combination of multiple potential outcomes. When a measurement is made, the wave function collapses and one outcome becomes actual. This collapse is probabilistic. The theory predicts the probability of each outcome, but does not specify which outcome will occur in any given instance. This framework has been tested in countless experiments. Electrons pass through double slits and produce interference patterns, revealing their wave-like nature. Photons separated by vast distances exhibit correlations that cannot be explained by classical physics. This is quantum entanglement. Particles can tunnel through energy barriers they should not classically be able to cross. All of this is reproducible, measurable, and consistent with the mathematics of quantum mechanics. Yet the theory is silent on one feature of the world: the presence of subjective experience. It describes the physical state of a brain with the same formalism it uses to describe an electron or a photon. It assigns a wave function, evolves it, predicts measurement outcomes. But nowhere in this formalism is there a term for awareness. Nowhere is there a variable that corresponds to the feeling of seeing red, the sensation of pain, the experience of thinking about a mathematical proof. This is not a failure of detail. It is not that quantum mechanics is incomplete because it has not yet calculated the exact configuration of neural microstates that correspond to a particular thought. The issue is more fundamental. Even if we had a perfect quantum mechanical description of every particle in a brain, the theory would still not tell us why that configuration is accompanied by subjective experience. It would tell us what the brain does, but not why there is something it is like to be that brain. This gap is sometimes called the explanatory gap, or the hard problem of consciousness. It is the difference between describing the physical processes that occur when someone sees red and explaining why those processes are accompanied by the subjective quality of redness. Quantum mechanics, like classical physics, provides the former, but not the latter. Some researchers have proposed that quantum processes in the brain might be necessary for consciousness. The most developed version of this idea is Penrose and Hummeroff's orchestrated objective reduction theory. This theory suggests that quantum superpositions develop in microtubules, protein structures inside neurons, and that consciousness arises when these superpositions collapse through a gravitational mechanism. The collapse is not triggered by measurement from outside, but occurs spontaneously when the superposition reaches a certain threshold. Penrose argues that this process is non-computable, meaning it cannot be replicated by any algorithm, and that this non-computability is necessary to explain aspects of human mathematical understanding. The theory is controversial. Most physicists regard it as implausible, primarily because of the decoherence problem. Quantum coherence is fragile. In warm, noisy environments like biological tissue, quantum superpositions are expected to collapse almost immediately due to interactions with the surrounding molecules. Calculations by Max Tegmark in 2000 suggested that quantum states in microtubules would decohere in femtoseconds, far too quickly to have any functional relevance for neural processes, which occur on timescales of milliseconds. However, recent evidence has complicated this objection. Quantum coherence has been observed in biological systems at room temperature. Photosynthetic complexes in plants maintain quantum coherence long enough to transfer energy efficiently. Birds may use quantum entanglement in their magnetic field sensors for navigation. These findings do not prove that consciousness is quantum, but they weaken the argument that quantum effects cannot persist in warm biological environments. In 2024, an experiment at Wellesley College tested a specific prediction of the orchestrated objective reduction theory. Rats were given a drug that stabilizes microtubules, then exposed to an anesthetic gas. If anesthetics work by disrupting quantum processes in microtubules, as the theory predicts, then stabilizing those microtubules should delay the onset of unconsciousness. The results were striking. Treated rats took significantly longer to lose consciousness compared to control animals. This does not prove the theory, but it provides empirical support for the hypothesis that microtubules play a role in the mechanism of anesthesia and, by extension, consciousness. Another experiment involved xenon isotopes. Xenon is an anesthetic gas. Chemically, all isotopes of the xenon are identical. They have the same number of electrons and participate in the same chemical reactions. The only difference is their nuclear spin, a quantum property. If consciousness depends on classical chemical interactions, all xenon isotopes should have the same anesthetic effect. But they do not. Different isotopes produce measurably different effects on consciousness in mice. This suggests that nuclear spin, a purely quantum property, influences the mechanism by which anesthetics suppress awareness. These results are suggestive, but not conclusive. They indicate that quantum processes may be involved in the physical substrate of consciousness, but they do not explain how or why those processes generate subjective experience. Even if microtubules support quantum coherence, and even if that coherence is disrupted by anesthetics, we still face the original question. Why does any physical process, quantum or classical, give rise to awareness? There are three broad responses to this question. One is eliminativism. This view holds that subjective experience is not a real feature of the world. It is a conceptual confusion or an illusion generated by the brain's self-monitoring processes. On this account, there is nothing that needs explaining beyond the physical mechanisms themselves. This position is difficult to sustain because the existence of subjective experience is the one fact we have direct access to. We may be mistaken about what we are experiencing, but we cannot be mistaken about the fact that we are experiencing something. A second response is dualism. This view holds that consciousness is not physical at all. It is a separate kind of substance or property, one that interacts with the physical world, but is not reducible to it. Quantum mechanics might describe the physical half of reality, while consciousness represents something fundamentally different. This solves the explanatory gap by denying that consciousness needs to be explained in physical terms. But it introduces new problems. If consciousness is non-physical, how does it interact with the brain? How does a non-physical decision cause a physical neuron to fire? Dualism has largely been abandoned in contemporary philosophy of mind, not because it has been refuted, but because it offers no mechanism and no predictions. A third response is to modify our understanding of physical reality. Perhaps quantum mechanics, as currently formulated, is incomplete. Perhaps there is a deeper theory that unifies the physical and the experiential. Penrose's objective reduction proposal is one attempt in this direction. It suggests that consciousness corresponds to moments when quantum superpositions collapse, and that these collapses are physical events governed by quantum gravity. This would make consciousness a fundamental feature of the universe, not a byproduct of neural complexity. But even if objective reduction occurs, it is not clear why those events would be accompanied by subjective experience. The theory provides a physical mechanism for state reduction, but it does not explain why that mechanism generates awareness, rather than simply producing a physical outcome without any associated experience. The explanatory gap remains. The binding problem presents a related difficulty. When you perceive an object, your visual system processes colour, shape, motion, and location in different brain regions at different times. Yet you experience the object as a unified whole. How does the brain combine these distributed processes into a single coherent experience? Classical neuroscience struggles with this question because neurons in different regions are physically separate. There is no single location where all the information comes together. Quantum approaches suggest a possible solution. Quantum entanglement creates genuine physical unity across spatial separation. If neurons are entangled, they form a single quantum system rather than a collection of independent parts. This could provide a mechanism for binding distributed information into a unified experience. However, this only addresses the structural aspect of binding, how information is integrated, not the phenomenal aspect, why integration produces a subjective experience rather than simply a coordinated physical state. The current state of knowledge is this: quantum mechanics provides an extraordinarily accurate description of physical systems. It explains the behavior of atoms, molecules, and larger structures with remarkable precision. It has enabled technologies that define modern life, but it offers no account of subjective experience. Neuroscience can map which brain states correlate with which conscious experiences, but correlation is not explanation. Philosophy can clarify the conceptual structure of the problem, but conceptual clarity is not empirical evidence. Some researchers propose that consciousness requires new physics. Others argue that consciousness is an emergent property of complex information processing, and that no modification of quantum mechanics is necessary. Still others suggest that the question itself may be malformed, that we are asking for an explanation of something that does not require one. What remains certain is that quantum mechanics, despite its success in describing the physical world, does not currently explain why awareness exists. The theory predicts probabilities, describes states, accounts for correlations, but it does not, and perhaps cannot, tell us why there is something it is like to undergo those states. Yet there is one piece of experimental evidence that refuses to sit comfortably within either classical neuroscience or standard quantum mechanics. It involves structures so small they were long dismissed as mere scaffolding, and a phenomenon so subtle it required decades of technological refinement to detect. In 2024, a team at Wellesley College conducted what appeared to be a straightforward experiment. They administered a drug called apothelone B to laboratory rats before exposing them to isoflurane, a common anesthetic gas. Apothelone B binds to microtubules, cylindrical protein structures that exist in virtually all eukaryotic cells, and stabilizes them against disruption. The prediction, derived from the orchestrated objective reduction theory proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff in the 1990s, was specific. If consciousness depends on quantum processes within microtubules, and anesthetics work by disrupting those processes, then stabilizing the microtubules should delay the loss of consciousness. The rats treated with the apothelone B took over a minute longer to lose consciousness than control animals. This is not a vague correlation. The effect was measurable, repeatable, and precisely aligned with the theoretical prediction. It suggests that something about the physical state of microtubules, something that can be chemically protected, plays a role in maintaining consciousness. But what that something is remains unclear. Microtubules are not exotic structures. They form the cytoskeleton of cells, providing structural support and serving as tracks for molecular transport. In neurons, they are particularly abundant. Each microtubule is a hollow cylinder composed of 13 columns of protein dimers called tubulin, arranged in a repeating lattice. The regularity of this structure, combined with the electronic properties of tubulin proteins, has led some researchers to speculate that microtubules might function as more than passive scaffolding. The Ork-Or theory proposes that tubulin proteins within microtubules can exist in quantum superposition states. These superpositions would involve the position of electrons within hydrophobic pockets in the tubulin structure, regions where quantum coherence might be shielded from the surrounding cellular environment. As synaptic inputs arrive and neural activity proceeds, these superpositions would become increasingly entangled across networks of microtubules in many neurons. When the superposition reaches a threshold determined by quantum gravitational effects, it undergoes objective reduction, a physical collapse governed not by measurement, but by the structure of space-time itself. This collapse, according to the theory, corresponds to a moment of conscious experience. The theory makes several claims that distinguish it from standard quantum mechanics. First, it proposes that wave function collapse is not merely an interaction with a macroscopic measuring device, but a real physical process triggered by a critical mass-energy difference in superposed states. Second, it connects this process to quantum gravity, suggesting that consciousness involves the geometry of space-time at the Planck scale. Third, it predicts that anesthetics should work by disrupting quantum coherence in microtubules rather than solely through classical biochemical mechanisms. The Wellesley experiment tested the third prediction, but it does not validate the entire theory. It shows that microtubule stability affects the duration of consciousness under anesthesia. It does not demonstrate quantum superposition in microtubules, nor does it confirm that objective reduction occurs, nor does it explain why such a process would generate subjective experience. Another line of evidence comes from a different phenomenon. In studies conducted at the University of Alberta, researchers found that anesthetics accelerate a process called delayed luminescence in microtubules. When microtubules are exposed to ultraviolet light, they absorb photons and re-emit them over extended periods, sometimes seconds. This re-emission is not simple fluorescence. It appears to involve coordinated release of trapped energy from networks of tryptophan amino acids distributed throughout the tubulin structure. In 2024, a separate study confirmed that these tryptophan networks exhibit superradiance, a quantum optical effect in which multiple emitters synchronize their photon emission, producing coherent radiation stronger than the sum of individual emissions. Superradiance requires quantum coherence among the emitters. The fact that it occurs in biological structures at room temperature was unexpected. Warm, wet environments were long assumed to destroy quantum coherence too rapidly for it to play any functional role, but photosynthesis had already demonstrated otherwise. Light harvesting complexes in plants and bacteria maintain quantum coherence for hundreds of femtoseconds at physiological temperatures, enabling near-perfect energy transfer efficiency. Birds appear to use quantum effects in cryptochrome proteins for magnetic field detection during navigation. The warm, wet, noisy objection has been weakened by these findings. The question is no longer whether quantum effects can occur in biology, but whether they occur in the brain, and whether they matter for consciousness. The decoherence problem remains the central challenge. Max Tegmark calculated in 2000 that quantum coherence in microtubules should collapse within 10 to the power of minus 13 seconds at brain temperatures, far too brief to influence neural processes occurring over milliseconds. Later calculations by Hameroff, Hagen and Tuschinski revised this estimate by accounting for dielectric shielding, ordered water layers near microtubule surfaces, and the protected environment of hydrophobic pockets. Their revised decoherence times ranged from 10 to the minus fifth power to 10 to the minus fourth power seconds, potentially long enough to matter. These are estimates, not measurements. Direct observation of quantum states in living neurons remains beyond current experimental capability. What exists instead is indirect evidence. The microtubule stabilization experiment, the superradiance findings, the isotope effects of xenon anesthetics, and the fact that single-celled organisms without neurons exhibit complex behavior and can be anesthetized. The xenon isotope experiment is particularly striking. Xenon is a noble gas that induces anesthesia through mechanisms not fully understood. In 2018, researchers tested 4 isotopes of xenon, chemically identical atoms differing only in nuclear spin, a quantum property. Different isotopes produced measurably different anesthetic effects in mice. Since chemical reactions depend on electron configurations, and since all xenon isotopes have identical electron structures, the difference cannot be explained by classical chemistry. Nuclear spin does not participate in chemical bonding, yet it affected consciousness. This suggests that some aspect of consciousness is sensitive to quantum properties that have no classical analogue. It does not prove that consciousness is quantum, but it implies that any complete account of anesthetic mechanisms must include quantum effects that classical neurochemistry cannot capture. Still, none of this addresses the hard problem. Even if quantum processes occur in microtubules, even if objective reduction happens, even if consciousness requires quantum coherence, none of these facts explain why physical processes generate subjective experience. The explanatory gap remains. Quantum mechanics provides a more complex substrate than classical neural networks, but it does not bridge the gulf between physical state and phenomenal awareness. Some philosophers argue that quantum theories of consciousness simply relocate the mystery without solving it. Instead of asking why neurons firing produces experience, we ask why quantum superpositions collapsing produces experience. The form of the question is unchanged. Penrose has suggested that the answer may lie in the connection between consciousness and the fundamental structure of space-time, that awareness is not an emergent property of complex systems, but a basic feature of reality that manifests when quantum gravity effects become relevant. This would make consciousness intrinsic to physics rather than a biological accident. But this is speculation. Quantum gravity itself remains an unsolved problem. No experiment has yet detected quantum gravitational effects, and no unified theory reconciles general relativity with quantum mechanics. Basing a theory of consciousness on physics that does not yet exist introduces additional layers of uncertainty. What can be said with confidence is that consciousness presents a measurement problem of its own. In standard quantum mechanics, measurement collapses the wave function, selecting one outcome from many possibilities. But what counts as measurement? A photon hitting a detector recording a result, a scientist reading the detector? Consciousness seems to be the point where quantum possibilities become definite experiences, yet the theory provides no account of how or why this occurs. Eugene Wigner proposed in the 1960s that consciousness itself causes wave function collapse. This idea has been largely abandoned, not because it was disproven, but because it introduces mind into physics without explaining mind. It replaces one mystery with another. The Ork-Or theory attempts a different strategy. It proposes that collapse is a physical process governed by objective thresholds, and that consciousness corresponds to these collapse events. This makes consciousness physical without making it classical. but it still does not explain the correspondence. The current situation is this. Quantum mechanics describes the behavior of matter with extraordinary precision. Neuroscience maps which brain states correlate with which conscious experiences. Philosophy clarifies the conceptual structure of the problem. But the connection between physical process and subjective awareness remains unknown. Whether quantum effects in microtubules are relevant to consciousness depends on questions that cannot yet be answered. Whether quantum coherence persists long enough in neural structures, whether objective reduction occurs, and most fundamentally, whether any physical process, quantum or classical, can account for the existence of experience. The evidence from microtubule stabilization, superradiance, and isotope effects suggests that quantum processes may be involved in the mechanisms that enable or modulate consciousness. But involvement is not explanation. Even if consciousness requires quantum mechanics, that requirement does not make quantum mechanics a theory of consciousness. It makes it a necessary condition, not a sufficient account. Perhaps the deeper problem is that we keep treating quantum mechanics and consciousness as two separate mysteries that might illuminate each other when they may simply be unrelated facts about the universe that happen to coexist. Quantum processes occur in neurons. Consciousness exists. The connection between these statements is not obvious. Most research on quantum effects in biology focuses on demonstrable functions. Photosynthesis exploits quantum coherence to achieve nearly perfect energy transfer efficiency. The protein complexes that harvest light energy maintain coherent superpositions for hundreds of femtoseconds, long enough to explore multiple pathways simultaneously and select the optimal route. This is measurable. It confers evolutionary advantage. The mechanism can be studied experimentally. Bird navigation may involve quantum entanglement in cryptochrome proteins within the retina. European robins appear to sense Earth's magnetic field through radical pairs, molecules with unpaired electrons whose quantum states respond to magnetic orientation. Experiments blocking cryptochrome function disrupt the bird's ability to navigate. Again, this represents a testable hypothesis about a specific biological function served by quantum phenomena. The proposed role of quantum mechanics in consciousness differs fundamentally from these cases. There is no clearly defined function that quantum processes in microtubules would perform. The OR theory suggests quantum computation, but computation toward what end? Classical neural networks already compute. What aspect of conscious experience requires quantum rather than classical computation? One answer involves the binding problem. When you perceive a moving red ball, different regions of your visual cortex process color, motion, shape, and location separately. These features are extracted by distinct neural populations operating at different speeds. Yet you experience a unified object, one ball with all properties integrated into a single percept. How? Classical solutions propose synchronized neural firing or convergent processing in higher cortical areas. But these remain correlational explanations. They describe what happens, but not how separate processes become unified experience. Quantum approaches suggest that entanglement provides genuine unity rather than mere correlation. Multiple neurons linked by quantum coherence would constitute a single system rather than separate parts coordinated by signals. This addresses the conceptual problem but introduces new difficulties. For quantum entanglement to unify neural processes, the relevant quantum states must remain coherent, long enough to span the time window of conscious integration, roughly tens of milliseconds. The original decoherence calculations by Tegmark suggested this was impossible. Revised calculations by Hameroff's group extended the timescales but remain controversial. The issue is not settled. Even if coherence persists long enough, a second problem emerges. Quantum mechanics describes systems that exist in superposition until measured. But conscious experience is never ambiguous in this way. You never experience simultaneously seeing and not seeing red. Each moment of awareness has definite content, not a superposition of possibilities. Standard quantum mechanics requires an external measurement to collapse superposition into definite outcomes. What performs this measurement in the brain? Penrose's objective reduction proposal attempts to solve this by making collapse a physical process rather than measurement dependent. When quantum superpositions involve sufficient mass distribution across space, quantum gravitational effects cause spontaneous collapse. This provides a physical mechanism for definite outcomes without requiring external observers. But objective reduction is not part of established quantum mechanics. It represents a proposed modification to the theory, motivated by conceptual problems in quantum gravity. No experiment has confirmed that gravity causes wave function collapse. The prediction depends on physics that does not yet exist in complete form. Basing a theory of consciousness on speculative modifications to quantum mechanics compounds uncertainty rather than resolving it. The isotope experiments with the Xenon anesthetics provide intriguing data. Chemically identical isotopes, differing only in nuclear spin, produced measurably different anesthetic effects in mice. Nuclear spin is a quantum property that should not affect classical chemistry. The observation suggests that quantum states influence the mechanism of consciousness, yet the interpretation remains ambiguous. The experiments show that nuclear spin correlates with anesthetic effect. They do not demonstrate that quantum coherence in the sense required by haute spatially extended superpositions across multiple neurons, plays a functional role. The isotope effect might reflect some other quantum property at the molecular level that influences how anesthetics bind to their targets. The microtubule stabilization experiments present similar interpretative challenges. Rats pre-treated with drugs that stabilize microtubules took longer to lose consciousness under anesthesia. This confirms that microtubule state affects consciousness, but stabilization could matter for many reasons. Microtubules serve structural and transport functions essential for synaptic transmission. Disrupting them might impair neural function through entirely classical mechanisms. Demonstrating that quantum processes in microtubules specifically contribute to consciousness would require experiments that distinguish quantum from classical effects. One would need to show that interventions affecting quantum coherence without disturbing classical functions alter conscious states in predictable ways. Such experiments face enormous technical challenges. Measuring quantum coherence in living neural tissue without destroying it remains beyond current capabilities. The broader pattern across all these experiments is that they identify correlations between microscale physical phenomena and macroscale conscious states. Correlations are not mechanisms. The fact that anesthetic agents affect both consciousness and microtubule dynamics does not prove that microtubule quantum states constitute consciousness. It proves only that some aspect of microtubule function matters for consciousness. This returns us to the explanatory gap. Even if quantum processes occur in neurons, even if they prove necessary for consciousness, this necessity does not explain why physical processes, quantum or otherwise, generate subjective experience. A complete physical description of a brain state, down to every quantum degree of freedom, would still not predict what it feels like to be that brain. David Chalmers argues that no amount of additional physics can close this gap. Whether the underlying processes are classical neurons firing or quantum superpositions collapsing makes no difference to the fundamental problem. Both describe objective physical events. Neither explains subjective awareness. The form of the question remains unchanged. Some philosophers respond by embracing panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex systems. If consciousness is basic, like mass or charge, then quantum mechanics might connect to it not by producing consciousness, but by providing the physical substrate through which fundamental consciousness manifests. This philosophical move dissolves the hard problem by denying its premise. It asserts that asking how physical processes generate consciousness is the wrong question. Consciousness is already present at the fundamental level. But panpsychism introduces its own problems. How does fundamental microconsciousness combine into unified macroconsciousness? Why does a brain support rich experience while a rock does not, if both are made of matter with intrinsic consciousness? The auteur theory can be interpreted panpsychistically. Penrose has suggested that consciousness might be connected to the most basic level of physical reality, the structure of space-time itself. Objective reduction events would then correspond to moments when fundamental consciousness actualizes into specific experienced states. This makes consciousness intrinsic to physics rather than produced by it. But this remains speculation. Quantum gravity is unsolved. Space-time structure at the Planck scale is unknown. No experiment has detected quantum gravitational effects. Building a theory of consciousness on this foundation assumes physics that does not yet exist. It replaces one mystery with several others. The epistemic situation is this: quantum mechanics provides extraordinarily precise predictions for physical systems. Consciousness exists as an undeniable fact of first-person experience. Whether quantum mechanics is relevant to consciousness depends on empirical questions that cannot yet be definitively answered and conceptual questions that may have no scientific answer. If microtubule quantum coherence proves too fragile to survive in neural environments, quantum theories of consciousness fail empirically. If coherence persists, but can be explained as epiphenomenal, occurring alongside consciousness without contributing to it, the theory loses explanatory power. If quantum processes prove necessary, but do not address why physical processes generate experience, we gain mechanism without understanding. Current evidence suggests quantum effects occur in biological systems more readily than previously assumed. Photosynthesis, magnetoreception, and possibly olfaction exploit quantum phenomena. The question is whether evolution has also discovered ways to harness quantum effects for neural information processing, and whether such processing relates to consciousness rather than merely to unconscious computation. The Xenon isotope experiments and microtubule stabilization studies provide suggestive evidence but not proof. They show that quantum-level properties correlate with conscious states. They do not demonstrate that quantum coherence in the specific sense required by OR, extended superposition spanning multiple neurons, constitutes the substrate of awareness. What can be stated clearly is that consciousness presents physics with a measurement problem of its own. In standard quantum mechanics, measurement collapses superpositions, selecting definite outcomes from quantum possibilities. but the theory provides no account of what constitutes measurement. A photon hitting a detector leaves a physical record, but when does a physical record become an observation? When does objective physical process become subjective experience? This question has no agreed answer. Some interpretations eliminate it by denying collapse entirely. Many worlds says all outcomes occur in separate branches. Others make collapse objective. Spontaneous localization theories propose physical mechanisms. Still others make consciousness fundamental. Consciousness causes collapse, or collapse creates consciousness. Each interpretation solves some problems while creating others. Many worlds avoids collapse but multiplies ontology extravagantly. Objective collapse requires new physics. Consciousness-based interpretations introduce mind into fundamental physics without explaining mind. The Or theory represents one attempt to connect these pieces, making collapse objective through quantum gravity while linking collapse events to moments of consciousness. This provides an integrated picture. But integration is not evidence. The theory might be conceptually elegant and empirically false. What remains certain is that quantum mechanics, despite its predictive success, does not explain awareness. It describes how particles behave. It predicts measurement outcomes with extraordinary accuracy. But it says nothing about why some physical systems, brains, give rise to inner experience while others, rocks, computers, apparently do not. Whether this explanatory gap can be closed by better understanding of quantum processes in neurons, or whether it represents a permanent limitation in the scope of physical explanation remains unknown. The experiments continue. The calculations become more sophisticated. The philosophical debates persist. The central mystery endures. The puzzle begins not with consciousness, but with measurement. In 1932, John von Neumann demonstrated mathematically that quantum mechanics contains no internal mechanism to explain when or how a superposition becomes a single outcome. The formalism predicts probabilities with extraordinary precision. It does not explain collapse. This gap has persisted for nearly a century, generating dozens of interpretations but no consensus resolution. The measurement problem is not philosophical decoration. It represents a genuine incompleteness in the theory's explanatory structure. Quantum systems evolve deterministically according to the Schrödinger equation until measurement occurs. Then the system discontinuously transitions to a definite state. The theory provides no account of what constitutes measurement, where the boundary lies between quantum and classical regimes, or what physical mechanism, if any, enacts this transition. Standard responses to this problem fall into several categories. The Copenhagen interpretation treats measurement as a primitive concept, refusing to analyze it further. Many worlds eliminates collapse by asserting all outcomes occur in parallel branches. Bohmian mechanics adds hidden variables to restore determinism. Objective collapse theories modify quantum mechanics to include spontaneous localization mechanisms. Each approach resolves certain difficulties while introducing others. What none of these interpretations address is the relationship between physical measurement and conscious observation. A photon detector leaves a physical record. So does a photographic plate. So does a mark on paper. At what point does physical record become observation? When does objective process generate subjective awareness? This question becomes particularly acute when considering delayed choice experiments. In these setups, the configuration of measuring apparatus can be changed after a photon has already passed through a double slit but before its detection. The photon's behavior, whether it exhibits wave-like interference or particle-like localization, appears to depend on measurement choices made after its trajectory has been completed. The past behavior of the photon becomes determined by future measurement decisions. The phenomenon is well established experimentally. Its interpretation remains contested. Does the measurement retroactively influence past events? Does information about the photon's path only become defined when measurement occurs, regardless of temporal sequence? Or does the entire concept of when something happens break down at quantum scales? Eugene Wigner proposed in the 1960s that consciousness might play an essential role in quantum mechanics, arguing that only awareness can collapse superpositions. His reasoning proceeded from the measurement chain. A quantum system interacts with a detector, the detector with a recording device, the device with a human observer. If quantum mechanics applies to all physical systems, then the detector itself should enter superposition, as should the recording device and even the observer's brain. Collapse can only occur when something outside the physical chain, consciousness, intervenes. Most physicists rejected Wigner's interpretation. Measurement requires only irreversible physical interaction with a macroscopic apparatus, not conscious observation. A photographic plate records interference patterns whether anyone looks at it or not. The universe presumably contained quantum measurements for billions of years before consciousness evolved. Invoking awareness seems both unnecessary and scientifically problematic. Yet the question of what constitutes measurement persists. Decoherence theory shows how quantum superpositions become effectively classical through environmental interaction. When a quantum system becomes entangled with its environment, information about the system disperses irreversibly, making interference effects unobservable. This explains why macroscopic objects appear classical, not because they lack quantum properties, but because their quantum coherence is destroyed by constant environmental interaction. Decoherence solves the practical measurement problem by explaining why we observe definite outcomes rather than superpositions. It does not solve the conceptual measurement problem. After decoherence, the combined system of object plus environment remains in superposition, merely in a form where different branches no longer interfere. The question of why one particular outcome is experienced rather than another has not been addressed. This is where consciousness theories enter the discussion. If physical processes alone cannot explain the selection of one outcome from quantum possibilities, perhaps consciousness represents the missing element, not as a mystical force that influences particles, but as the aspect of reality where definite experience occurs. The orchestrated objective reduction theory attempts to formalize this connection through specific physical mechanisms. Penrose proposes that quantum superpositions involving sufficient mass differences collapse spontaneously due to quantum gravitational effects. These collapse events occur on timescales determined by the relationship between mass distribution and space-time geometry. Hameroff identifies microtubules as potential sites for such quantum processes in neurons, suggesting that coordinated collapse events across networks of microtubules correspond to moments of conscious experience. The theory makes testable predictions. It predicts specific decoherence timescales for microtubules that differ from standard calculations. It predicts that stabilizing microtubules should affect consciousness. It predicts that anesthetics work by disrupting quantum coherence in microtubules rather than through purely classical mechanisms. Recent experiments provide some support. The 2024 study showing delayed unconsciousness in rats treated with microtubules stabilizing drugs directly tested an haute prediction. The observation of superradiance in tryptophan networks at physiological temperatures demonstrates that quantum coherence can persist in biological structures longer than previously assumed. The Xenon isotope experiments suggest nuclear spin states influence anesthetic potency, implicating quantum properties in consciousness modulation. None of this constitutes proof. The microtubule stabilization results could reflect classical mechanisms. Superradiance in proteins does not demonstrate quantum coherence in microtubule networks across multiple neurons. The xenon isotope effects might involve subtle chemical differences not captured by standard models. The deeper issue is whether solving the mechanism question addresses the explanatory gap. Suppose quantum coherence in microtubules proves necessary for consciousness. Suppose objective reduction events correlate perfectly with moments of awareness. We would have established that certain quantum processes accompany consciousness. We would not have explained why those processes generate subjective experience. This is the hard problem that quantum theories inherit from classical neuroscience. Identifying neural correlates of consciousness does not explain consciousness. Identifying quantum correlates of consciousness does not explain it either. The question of why any physical process, quantum or classical, should be accompanied by inner experience remains. Some quantum approaches attempt to address this by making consciousness fundamental rather than emergent. In panpsychist frameworks, awareness is a basic property of matter, like mass or charge. Quantum mechanics might describe how elementary conscious elements combine into complex experiences. Objective reduction could represent the moment when distributed proto-conscious states unify into definite experience. These frameworks avoid the hard problem by refusing to derive consciousness from non-conscious components. They face different challenges. If consciousness is fundamental, why does it appear absent in rocks and present in brains? What combination principle governs how simple conscious elements merge? How can fundamental consciousness be tested or verified? The binding problem illustrates these difficulties. Your visual experience integrates color, shape, motion, and location processed in different brain regions. Yet you experience a unified scene, not disconnected features. Classical neuroscience struggles to explain this unity. There is no single region where all information converges, no master neuron that sees the integrated picture. Quantum approaches suggest entanglement could solve binding by creating genuinely holistic states. When quantum systems become entangled, they possess properties that cannot be reduced to properties of individual components. An entangled state of electrons in separate atoms represents a single quantum system, not two systems that happen to be correlated. If consciousness involves quantum entanglement across neuronal networks, unified experience would reflect genuine physical unity rather than mere correlation. This proposal shifts the problem without resolving it. Why should entangled quantum states generate unified experience, while classically correlated states do not? Entanglement provides mechanism for unity, but not explanation for awareness. The gap between physical description and experiential reality remains. The epistemic situation is this: quantum mechanics successfully describes physical systems, but says nothing about awareness. Consciousness exists as undeniable first-person fact, but lacks agreed physical explanation. Whether quantum processes are relevant to consciousness depends on empirical questions that remain open and conceptual questions that may lack scientific answers. If microtubule quantum coherence proves too fragile to survive in neural environments, quantum consciousness theories fail empirically. If coherence persists but proves epiphenomenal, occurring alongside consciousness without contributing to it, the theories lose explanatory power. If quantum processes prove necessary but do not address why physical processes generate experience, we gain mechanism without understanding. Current evidence suggests biology exploits quantum effects more readily than previously assumed. Photosynthesis, magnetoreception, possibly olfaction employ quantum phenomena. Evolution may have discovered ways to harness quantum processes for neural computation. Whether such computation relates to consciousness or merely to unconscious information processing remains unknown. The Xenon isotope and microtubule stabilization experiments provide suggestive correlations. They do not demonstrate that extended quantum superpositions spanning multiple neurons constitute awareness's substrate. They show quantum-level properties correlate with conscious states. They do not prove quantum coherence in the specific sense OR requires. Macroscopic superpositions orchestrated across neuronal networks generate subjective experience. What remains clear is that quantum mechanics, despite predictive success, does not explain awareness. It describes particle behavior and predicts measurement outcomes with extraordinary accuracy. It says nothing about why some physical systems give rise to inner experience, while others apparently do not. Whether this explanatory gap can be closed through better understanding of quantum processes in neurons, or whether it represents permanent limitation in physical explanation scope, remains unresolved. The experiments continue. Calculations grow more sophisticated. Philosophical debates persist. The central mystery endures, not as failure of science, but as boundary marking, where current understanding stops and genuine ignorance begins. The question is whether we are asking something physics can answer, or whether the boundary we face is not limitation, but category error. Physics describes relationships between measurable quantities. It predicts outcomes of interactions. It maps correlations with extraordinary precision. Quantum mechanics has succeeded not by explaining what particles are, but by predicting what they will do when subjected to specified conditions. The theory makes no ontological commitment about underlying substance. It remains agnostic about interpretation. This agnosticism is strength, not weakness. It allows the formalism to function across contexts where intuitive pictures fail. Consciousness presents different challenge. It is not observable from outside. No instrument detects awareness itself, only neural correlates that accompany it. Correlation is not mechanism. When functional imaging shows prefrontal cortex activity during decision-making, we observe electrical patterns and blood flow changes. We do not observe the subjective feeling of choosing, the sense of deliberation, the experience of intending. These remain private, accessible only to the system experiencing them. Some argue this privacy is merely epistemic, a problem of measurement access that better technology might overcome. Others argue it is ontological, a fundamental difference between third-person description and first-person experience that no amount of physical information can bridge. The distinction matters for how we interpret quantum consciousness proposals. If consciousness is simply information processing at quantum scales, then it is physical process subject to physical investigation. If consciousness involves irreducible subjective character that exists alongside but cannot be reduced to physical processes, then quantum mechanics might describe correlates without explaining awareness itself. The OR theory attempts to navigate this divide by proposing that conscious moments correspond to actual physical events, objective reductions of quantum states. This makes consciousness neither epiphenomenal nor mysterious. It becomes causal, physically real, embedded in space-time geometry. But this maneuver raises its own question. Why should objective reduction generate subjective experience? Penrose proposes mathematical non-computability as key feature distinguishing conscious from unconscious processes. Human mathematical insight, he argues, exceeds algorithmic capability demonstrated by Gödel's incompleteness theorems. This non-computability requires new physics beyond standard quantum mechanics. Objective reduction provides the needed ingredient. The argument is intricate but not conclusive. Critics note that Gödel's theorem concerns formal systems, not necessarily biological cognition. Perhaps human mathematical understanding is computationally complex rather than non-computable. Perhaps we mistake our inability to introspect our own algorithms for evidence of non-algorithmic processing. The debate remains unresolved because we lack clear, empirical, test-distinguishing, computational from non-computational cognitive processes. Hameroff's contribution grounds the theory in specific biological structures. Microtubules provide plausible substrate. Their geometry, electronic properties, and ubiquity in neurons make them candidates for quantum information processing. The anesthetic evidence adds suggestive correlation. Single-celled organisms possessing microtubule-based cytoskeletons respond to same agents that abolish human consciousness. This suggests conserved molecular target predating nervous systems. Yet correlation is not causation. Perhaps anesthetics disrupt classical microtubule function, molecular transport, structural integrity, regulation of synaptic transmission, and consciousness vanishes because these classical functions are necessary for neural processing. Quantum coherence in microtubules might occur without being relevant to consciousness. The system might exploit quantum effects for computation, while awareness emerges from entirely different mechanism. This possibility highlights central difficulty. We cannot directly observe whether quantum coherence contributes to consciousness or merely accompanies it. We can measure decoherence times, observe superradiance in tryptophan networks, stabilize microtubules, and delay unconsciousness. But these measurements tell us about quantum processes in biological substrates. They do not tell us whether those processes generate, enable, or simply correlate with subjective experience. The Xenon isotope experiment illustrates this ambiguity. Different nuclear spin states produce different anesthetic effects despite chemical identity. This suggests quantum-level properties influence consciousness. But influence how? Perhaps spin states affect quantum coherence duration in neural microtubules, and this affects information integration that consciousness requires. Or perhaps spin states influence entirely classical processes, membrane protein dynamics, neurotransmitter binding, through subtle quantum mechanical effects on molecular geometry. The correlation is real. The mechanism remains obscure. Current evidence establishes that quantum effects occur in biological systems at physiological temperatures more readily than previously assumed. Photosynthesis, magnetoreception, possibly olfaction, employ quantum coherence. Evolution has had billions of years to discover whether quantum processes offer computational advantages. If they do, neural systems might exploit them. Whether this exploitation relates to consciousness or merely to unconscious information processing is a separate question. The binding problem remains. classical neuroscience cannot explain how distributed neural processes generate unified experience, quantum entanglement offers potential mechanism. Entangled systems possess holistic properties irreducible to component properties. This matches phenomenology of unified consciousness. But mechanism is not explanation. Why should holistic quantum states feel like anything? Why should physical unity generate experiential unity? The gap persists. Some propose panpsychism, that consciousness is fundamental property of matter, present at all scales, but organized differently in complex systems. This dissolves the hard problem by denying that consciousness emerges from unconscious components, but it creates new puzzles. How do simple conscious elements combine into complex consciousness? Why does consciousness appear absent in rocks and present in brains, if both are composed of same fundamental constituents possessing proto-experiential properties? Others maintain that consciousness is purely physical, but requires understanding we currently lack. Perhaps new physics beyond quantum mechanics and general relativity will explain awareness without invoking fundamentally new ontology. Perhaps explanation will come from better understanding of how quantum processes interface with classical neural dynamics. Perhaps information integration at quantum scales generates awareness through principles we have not yet discovered. The epistemic situation is this. Quantum mechanics describes physical systems with unprecedented accuracy, but says nothing about awareness. Consciousness exists as undeniable first-person fact, but lacks agreed physical explanation. Whether quantum processes are relevant to consciousness depends on empirical questions that remain open and conceptual questions that may lack scientific answers. If microtubule quantum coherence proves too fragile to survive in neural environments, quantum consciousness theories fail empirically. If coherence persists but proves epiphenomenal, occurring alongside consciousness without contributing to it, the theories lose explanatory power. If quantum processes prove necessary but do not address why physical processes generate experience, we gain mechanism without understanding. The experiments continue, calculations grow more sophisticated, philosophical debates persist, but the central mystery endures, not as failure of science, but as boundary marking where current understanding stops. Physics explains structure, behavior, and interaction. It predicts measurement outcomes and describes dynamical evolution. It does not, and perhaps cannot, explain why certain physical systems possess inner experience, while others apparently do not. This is not gap destined to close through incremental progress. It may represent permanent limitation in physical explanation scope. Or perhaps the limitation is conceptual rather than empirical. Perhaps we ask wrong question when we demand that physics explain awareness. Physics describes what systems do, not what they are like from inside. This asymmetry is not defect in physics, but feature of its method. Science studies third-person, observable phenomena. Consciousness is first-person experiential reality. The two perspectives may not admit complete translation. This does not make consciousness unreal or epiphenomenal. It suggests that complete account of reality requires both physical description and experiential acknowledgement. Neither reduces to the other. Both are aspects of unified existence that current theoretical frameworks cannot fully integrate. Quantum mechanics complicates this picture because it introduces observation, measurement, and contextuality into fundamental physics. The theory requires distinguishing measured from unmeasured states. It introduces apparent role for observer even at physical foundation. This has prompted speculation that consciousness plays a fundamental role in quantum reality. But this speculation confuses epistemic with ontological questions. Quantum mechanics requires measurement to collapse superposition into definite outcome. Measurement is physical interaction, leaving irreversible record, not conscious perception. Consciousness may be correlated with certain measurements, specifically those occurring in functioning brains, but correlation does not imply that consciousness causes collapse, or that collapse requires consciousness. The confusion persists because quantum mechanics itself remains incompletely understood. We lack consensus interpretation explaining what quantum formalism tells us about reality's nature. This interpretive ambiguity creates space for consciousness-related proposals. But ambiguity is not evidence. The fact that quantum mechanics is strange does not mean consciousness must be quantum. What remains clear is that explanation has limits. Physics explains much about nature's structure and behaviour. It predicts outcomes with extraordinary precision, but it does not explain awareness. Whether this limitation is temporary or permanent, empirical or conceptual, remains unknown. The question persists not because we lack data, but because we lack framework integrating physical description with experiential reality. Until such framework emerges, if it can, the relationship between quantum mechanics and consciousness remains open question at the intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. The uncertainty is uncomfortable, but honest. It marks boundary between what we know and what we do not, between successful explanation and genuine mystery that current science cannot resolve. The question persists because measurement itself remains incompletely understood. Quantum mechanics requires distinguishing measured from unmeasured states. This distinction is operational, not ontological. The theory tells us what happens when we perform measurements. It does not tell us what constitutes measurement at fundamental level. Decoherence explains how quantum systems become effectively classical through environmental interaction. It does not explain why environmental interaction counts as measurement, while isolated evolution does not. Some interpretations eliminate measurement as special category. Many worlds asserts all outcomes occur in parallel branches. There is no collapse, only branching. Bohmian mechanics adds hidden variables, restoring determinism. Particles have definite positions guided by wave function. Objective collapse theories modify quantum mechanics to include spontaneous localization mechanisms. Each interpretation resolves certain puzzles while creating others. None address relationship between physical measurement and conscious observation. A photographic plate records interference pattern whether anyone examines it or not. The universe presumably contained quantum measurements for billions of years before consciousness evolved. Invoking awareness seems unnecessary, yet the question of when physical interaction becomes observation, when potentiality becomes actuality, remains unanswered. This is where quantum consciousness theories attempt to contribute. If physical processes alone cannot explain selection of one outcome from quantum possibilities, perhaps consciousness represents missing element. Not as force influencing particles, but as aspect of reality where definite experience occurs. The Or theory formalizes this by proposing conscious moments correspond to objective reduction events, physical collapses governed by quantum gravitational thresholds rather than external measurement. But this proposal inherits the same explanatory gap. Why should objective reduction generate subjective experience? Penrose argues non-computability distinguishes conscious from unconscious processes. human mathematical insight exceeds algorithmic capability, requiring new physics beyond standard quantum mechanics. Objective reduction provides needed ingredient. Critics note that Gödel's theorem concerns formal systems, not necessarily biological cognition. Perhaps human understanding is computationally complex rather than non-computable. The debate remains unresolved because we lack clear empirical tests distinguishing these possibilities. Current evidence establishes that quantum effects occur in biological systems at physiological temperatures more readily than previously assumed. Photosynthesis, magnetoreception, possibly olfaction, employ quantum coherence. Evolution has had billions of years to discover whether quantum processes offer computational advantages. If they do, neural systems might exploit them. Whether exploitation relates to consciousness or merely to unconscious information, processing is a separate question. The microtubule stabilization and Xenon isotope experiments provide suggestive correlations. They demonstrate that quantum-level properties correlate with conscious states. They do not demonstrate that extended quantum superpositions spanning multiple neurons constitute awareness's substrate. The distinction matters. Correlation is not mechanism. Mechanism is not explanation. Physics describes what systems do, not what they are like from inside. This asymmetry is not defect but feature of scientific method. Science studies third-person, observable phenomena. Consciousness is first-person experiential reality. The two perspectives may not admit complete translation. This does not make consciousness unreal or epiphenomenal. It suggests complete account of reality requires both physical description and experiential acknowledgement. Neither reduces to the other. Quantum mechanics complicates this picture by introducing observation and contextuality into fundamental physics. The theory requires distinguishing measured from unmeasured states. It introduces apparent role for observer even at physical foundation, but this role is epistemic, not ontological. Measurement is physical interaction, leaving irreversible record. Consciousness may correlate with certain measurements, those occurring in functioning brains, but correlation does not imply consciousness causes collapse, or that collapse requires consciousness. The confusion persists because quantum mechanics itself remains incompletely understood. We lack consensus interpretation explaining what formalism tells us about reality's nature. This interpretive ambiguity creates space for consciousness-related proposals, but ambiguity is not evidence. Strangeness of quantum mechanics does not mean consciousness must be quantum. What remains clear is that explanation has limits. Physics explains much about nature's structure and behaviour. It predicts outcomes with extraordinary precision. But it does not explain awareness. Whether this limitation is temporary or permanent, empirical or conceptual, remains unknown. The question persists not because we lack data, but because we lack framework integrating physical description with experiential reality. Perhaps the boundary we face is not limitation, but category error. Perhaps we ask wrong question when we demand that physics explain awareness. Physics describes relationships between measurable quantities. It predicts outcomes of interactions. It maps correlations. Consciousness presents different challenge, not observable from outside, accessible only to system experiencing it. No instrument detects awareness itself, only neural correlates accompanying it. The experiments continue. Calculations grow more sophisticated. Philosophical debates persist, but the central mystery endures. Not as failure of science, but as boundary marking, where current understanding stops and genuine ignorance begins. quantum mechanics explains nature with unprecedented success. Whether it explains or can explain, awareness remains open question at intersection of physics, neuroscience, and philosophy. The uncertainty is uncomfortable, but honest.